Hi, I'm Shannon Vavra, a reporter with CyberScoop, and joining me today is John Redgrave, the CEO and co-founder of an abuse detection software company called Sentropy. Thanks for joining us today, John.
Thanks for having me, Shannon.
So I want to kick us off by starting about the basics about your company and the details. You emerged from stealth in recent months with $13 million in funding, including backing from Alexis Ohanian, the co-founder of Reddit. Tell us about what Sentropy is all about and what you track online.
Yeah, absolutely. Sentropy is a machine learning company at our core. And I founded Sentropy because I wanted to make the internet safer for my kids. I saw too many connections to what I was seeing online, whether that was mass shootings, um, systemic abuse of minorities, cyberbullying, trickling into the real world and having massive implications. And it's not just about my kids, but I wake up thinking a lot about the world my kids are going to grow up in and how can I improve that. So we're applying machine learning to the problem of abuse detection. Abuse detection, I think, as most people would recognize, is a huge problem. They might not understand how huge a problem it is, but every platform that has user generated content likely has some sort of abuse problem. And this is really about creating safer spaces for users to engage and create community, right? That's what a lot of these platforms are about, whether it's a dating site, a gaming company, a social media site. And so we wanted to help these companies with world-class, very cutting-edge machine learning technology that would allow them to identify things like hate speech, which we think of as identity attacks, things like racism, sexism, homophobia, xenophobia, things like threats of physical violence, people talking about shooting up government buildings, schools, right? Mass atrocity style attacks. And then we go all the way to places like white supremacist extremism, which is a real challenge in our country right now. And being able to detect that type of rhetoric so that kids, frankly, don't get red pilled into ideologies of hate. The last thing I'd talk about really quickly is we think a lot about users online and the psychological damage that hate might have on them. And we've seen a constant rise in issues around self-harm. And so we also have built some classification technology to identify when someone's at risk. It's not just about removing bad actors from platforms or these adversarial actors. It's also about identifying people who really need help, right? So we think about our technology as promoting positive social good.
Got it. And tell me a little bit more about how you and your company define abuse. There's obviously a lot of categories that fall under that definition. You've already named a few. How do you go about defining that and towing that line of being accused of political bias or anti conservative bias, especially in the political environment we're in these days?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think you can be pro free speech and anti hate speech. And so when we think about defining these problems, we're very rigorous. We go out and we talk to the experts in many different fields about something like white supremacist extremism. What does that actually mean? What does it mean to be white nationalist? What are the tendencies? What is the language that's being used there? And how are we making sure that we're giving the best technology and the best definitions of these problems to the companies? We have something like over 75 pages of just definitions. And these definitions aren't just text about what is the thing, it's actually data driven. So we think about the data and we look at data across many platforms to build our understanding. I should point out that at the end of the day, it's our job to build the best detection capabilities and the best workflow capabilities for people in trust and safety at these companies to do work very efficiently. I think about Iron Man quite a bit. This is about building the Iron Man suit for the people on the front lines of this problem. It's not our job, though, to tell them what is right or wrong, right? So in some respects, by building the definitions, we are saying this is something that's present, but we're not actually telling them you must remove this from your platform.
Gotcha. And so, walk us through a little bit about how your company actually tracks down different abusive behaviors or content and how that works for you.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that we think a lot about is abuse not being a platform problem, but an internet problem. And what I mean by that is language evolves so rapidly online that frankly, technology couldn't keep up with it up until about 5 years ago when there are some really big breakthroughs from a machine learning perspective. And so what we've done is we've built detection capabilities. We take a company's content. So we think of this as user generated content, and we run our classification technology over the top of that. Once we've run the classification technology, that is giving the company meta intelligence about the different forms of abuse, some of which I previously mentioned that we track. The critical bit here, though, is that we are not just thinking about this as a list of words, right? Because there's a real adaptive adversary problem. I mean, this is kind of like being in cybersecurity where you have bad actors who are constantly changing their patterns. It's the same thing in abuse detection. Let me give you an example. When Ahmaud Arbery was killed in Georgia, what we saw is a sect of the internet shifting from using the N word to using the term jogger. Now, if you can't pick up that word and then also the context in which that's being used, you have a real problem on your hands because you can't identify when you might have a potentially large set of bad actors on your platform that you may choose to remove and just allowing that to become normalized, right? I think a lot about systemic normalization of things like racism. And if you can't identify the new linguistic trends, the new trends from these abusive actors, you're not going to be able to keep up with the scale of this problem.
And you've said before too that cyber safety is a cybersecurity problem. And now, as a reporter at CyberScoop, I have to ask, what do you mean by that? Explain to our audience what your thinking is there.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, when I think about cybersecurity, and many moons ago, I worked at a company called Palantir, which does a lot of work in cybersecurity. Fundamentally, what you're looking for or dealing with is you're dealing with a set of adaptive adversaries who are constantly shifting their behavior. And companies have gotten very used to buying innovative, cutting edge tech to deal with this. A lot of machine learning tech to deal with this problem. Now, when I think about cybersecurity, people tend to think about, you know, um, huge attack vectors, right? Like some people fold fraud in there, scams, spam even gets folded into under the umbrella of the CISO, but user safety doesn't. And when you think about security, when you and I talk about security with our friends in the real world, right, in the physical world, we think about our own personal security. I think about user safety in that same context. And so I think more people need to consider cyber safety being part of the cybersecurity umbrella. And what that means is you have to adopt the most cutting edge techniques to identify when you have adaptive adversaries on your platform.
So, speaking of coming out of stealth, you haven't revealed publicly before which companies you work with. And I got to ask you on the record today, I know you might not be able to say, which companies are you working with? Are we talking big platforms, small, text messaging applications? You mentioned video game applications before. Who are you working with?
Yeah, so while I am not at liberty to talk about any of the companies by name, um, I can tell you that we work with three large verticals of companies. We work with companies in the social space, gaming space, and dating space. Now, we work with companies that have upwards of 100 million monthly active users. We also work with up and coming companies. These are the companies you might read about in Silicon Valley VC rags, right? That have just received 20, $50 million of funding as the next wave of social media. It's my belief that these next set of companies are going to treat user safety as a first class problem, right? It's no longer going to be something that's reactive. VCs are going to start asking in the room when you're in a fundraising pitch, what are you doing about user safety? What are you doing about trust and safety? And so I want Sentropy to be the brand that they think about that can help them or even frankly take over their trust and safety operations writ large. Because as a founder, what you really want to think about is writing code, growing your user base. You don't want to have to think about user safety, but you really should. Because it turns out that when you don't think about it, you have an equal likelihood of your company dying because of bad actors infiltrating your platform, right? User churn is something that people think about a lot from a revenue generation perspective, but they don't understand the ramifications of not dealing with abuse. And the ramification is your users will leave.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about that a little bit. Bringing it into current events, we've seen Facebook and Twitter face a lot of criticism, not just in the last several months, but over the last several years, based on how they handle either different abusive behaviors and content trickling into the real world and having a physical manifestation, and vice versa, like in Christchurch when there was a shooting at multiple mosques in New Zealand in 2017. And Facebook faced a lot of criticism for how it handled that. And obviously we're 3 years from that now, but we are still facing every other day, every single day, Facebook, Twitter, other social media platforms failing to or facing criticism for failing to address what some people see as abusive behavior, lies, misinformation. How do you think social media companies can prevent violence online and violent words online from spilling over into the real world? What can we do about this?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a technologist, so my initial inclination is always to talk about the technologies that we can deploy, but let me not do that actually, because I think there are technologies that can be deployed, but I think what actually needs to happen is more collaboration, right? I mean, the reality is, Facebook. So after the Christchurch shooting, did what I would view as a technologist an admirable job of yanking down videos on their platform, but I can still find that video online today. And
We
that's actually this
5 million times before. Yeah, it's all over.
I, it, and the scale of the platforms makes this problem very difficult, right? And that's why technology, it has to be a linchpin in the solution. But this is not a Facebook problem. It's not a Twitter problem. This is a internet problem, as I said. And so what we really need to see is increased collaboration. Frankly, there's probably tooling that could increase the collaboration. I mean, one of the benefits that we provide through Sentropy is we're learning the behaviors on every one of our customer systems, and we can extrapolate that back in a generalized form to then push that to every other one of our customers. This again goes back to the cybersecurity analogy. Like, this is how cybersecurity works, right? There's shared pattern intelligence sitting with these vendors, sitting inside these companies. I mean, people are collaborating because they recognize that if they get attacked, it's in their best interest to not let that attack spread. This is the challenge for social media. And I think technology can help, but what we really need to see is more industry collaboration. Because look, if you solve this problem at Facebook, that's great for Facebook. And it's a hard problem to solve at Facebook because of the scale. But what about the up and coming companies? Think of a platform like Reddit, which is not that up and coming. Think of a company like Discord, right? Which is massively grown over the past 5 years. How do you resolve these things if Facebook is sitting in a silo saying, okay, we've got this, we've got it under control, which they don't, but then it propagates to, the next biggest platform and the next biggest platform. I think that's the challenge we face. To me, collaboration, increased technology spending on this problem are the two fastest ways to address it at scale.
And you mentioned something I wanted to bring up as well, different misinformation or abusive behaviors hopping from one platform to another. Just recently, earlier this month, we saw with the election all sorts of misinformation, lies, claims about the election being stolen from President Trump, um, hopping from one platform to another through screenshots and different videos and allegations of fraud through videos that were doctored or appeared to be doctored. Um, right now, your company only focuses on text. In the future, what do you think this industry faces in facing videos, deep fakes, audio, images, and what's the horizon for when your company is going to move into that space?
Yeah, so I'll flip that on its head. We will be doing audio and image work in 2021. We recognize the importance of it. You have to be in multiple modalities to be able to address this problem across a broad enough landscape. It's clearly important. I think the challenge of content hopping between platforms it goes back to this point about collaboration. Like the reality is Twitter has done what I would say is a good job, right? It like, yes, is there more to do? Certainly. But in labeling tweets, in de-amplifying tweets, which I actually think is more important than labeling. Labeling has, quite a bit of study around it as to whether it creates, more problems than one would believe. But actually de-amplifying content is critically important. It's about stopping something from going viral and knowing and being able to detect that something might be being problematic. That's critical in being able to de-amplify. So again, that's part of the reason why we built detection at Sentropy. But the challenge again is once something hops to another platform, the other platform has a totally different set of policies. Think of YouTube, great example. I
Mm-hmm.
think YouTube has done a pretty poor job of dealing with the challenges of misinformation around the election.
How
They've
do you
let, yeah, they've let videos, claiming that the election has been stolen, sit up, and all they're willing to do is to demonetize the videos. Like, that doesn't actually solve the problem. It
mm-hmm.
doesn't solve the problem at all. It just means the videos can't get money, which is not the intent of those videos in the first place, right? It requires that those videos are de-amplified, and that when those videos pop up and YouTube knows about them, that when they pop over to Twitter, when they pop to Discord, when they pop to Reddit, that there's collaboration amongst those platforms. And I think, again, we're very far away from that level of collaboration. And in some ways, there's territoriality around the learnings, which may seem crazy to most people, but it is the reality that we're in today. And again, we need to move into this paradigm that looks closer to what cybersecurity looks like for user safety.
And so, speaking of moving forward into the future, obviously, in a Biden Harris administration, they said they would create a task force to curb online harassment and harassment in social media spaces. What do you think are some best practices that task force should embody or should be pushing out to the public? And what do you see for the future of online harassment curtailing?
Absolutely. So I'm really excited about the potential of a task force. I've spent some time speaking with the e-safety office, which was the first e-safety office in the world in Australia. And the mandate of that office is to make all of Australians' citizens feel safer online, right? It's such an admirable thing that I think almost everybody can get behind. And so the promise of that type of office popping up in our own government is really exciting to me. I think the reality of that type of office or even regulatory body is that you have to get industry participation. And frankly, I think there are a number of people in industry who are quite worried about what's going to happen with CDA 230 and are already starting to collaborate on what are the policy best practices. What are the sets of actions we take when, a terrorist video pops up on our platform? So that collaboration is starting to happen at the policy level, which is being almost forced by potential regulatory action, which could be quite damaging to the platforms around 230. I think the reality is the platforms and the people who are watching this data flow through their ecosystem every day, they have the best chance of actually building the right framework for this. And so I'd like to see even more industry participation in that type of group. I do worry a little bit about a regulatory body, not so much under Biden Harris, but under future administrations and what that could mean in terms of weaponizing that, right? The concept of user safety is so important, but fundamentally that body is going to be building policies and they're going to be building regulations of enforcement against platforms. Now, you can imagine all the ways that that could be used for, you know, less than positive purposes by people who don't have the right intent. And so I worry a lot about that. I think about China. Whenever I think about the most extreme version of this, I think about China, right? And what would it look like for a regulatory body to be spun up that could be weaponized in a way that, the Chinese have done through the Communist Party, to limit information and silence speech? Like, that's the thing that we need to be really careful about. But building the body, getting the right policies in place is the right first step. I think for the future, I think there are a couple of things. One, I think you're going to see more technologies that are entering the market. Either the market that we sit in today. There are going to be technologies that enhance collaboration. This could be done through crypto, right, and the blockchain, to allow people to share their best practices without feeling like they're giving up user information. Um, and then I think you're going to see regulation. Like, the reality is 230 is going to change. It's not if it's going to change anymore. It's about how it's going to change. I would love to see more accountability to be able to be afforded these protections, right? 230 was built as a sword and a shield. Today, it's mostly used as a shield, right? And it's a shield that is given for free, effectively. Like, there's very little required of a company to get that protection. And so accountability is the first step here. So I'm really excited about what the future holds in this space. I think we are where cybersecurity was about 10 odd years ago, right? So I think the next decade is going to really be about how do we protect people online and in their online experiences and keeping them safer.
Final question for you, because we are running out of time.
Sure.
Obviously, we've just passed election day, and we do have some incoming members of Congress who either give credence to QAnon and their conspiracy theories or have openly supported QAnon. In tracking down white supremacist aggression and that kinds of abusive content, and all of the definitions that your company uses to define what white supremacist content and aggression is, what should social media companies be thinking about moving forward in moderating that kind of content from specifically those incoming members of Congress?
Yeah, this is a tricky question, honestly, because I think the platforms have been pretty clear in their stance, at least the very large platforms, that they are going to remove QAnon content. I think that's the right stance. Our company and our stance is, we will build classifiers if companies find them valuable, right? We believe we can build the best detection capabilities. So will we build a QAnon classifier at some point in the future? Maybe. I don't want to commit to it. I think the platforms, though, have a responsibility to not allow the spread of misinformation. I mean, QAnon is using the same fundamentals to persecute, the set of victims that are in their crosshairs as the Romans did to the Christians, as the Christians did to the Jews, as we did during the Salem witch trials. Like, it's all the same rhetoric if you actually look historically. And I think it's really dangerous rhetoric. And it's rooted in some like very deeply held ideology amongst many people, unfortunately, across our country. But I think the platforms have a responsibility, and frankly, they have the right to remove this content. And I would advocate for them at least limiting the spread of it, because QAnon is no longer a small pool of people. It's a very, very large movement. And I think, as Kevin Roos at the Times has done a very good job discussing this, he's probably, in my opinion, one of the subject matter experts on QAnon. This is not something that is slowing down right now. It's actually speeding up. And I think if we believe that there will be continued harassment online, and frankly, that online harassment, especially with QAnon, is migrating into the real world, that's problematic,
I think
right?
we
And
already saw in 2018 with the Hoover Dam blockade. It was one of the first instances of QAnon spilling over into the real world. It's only sped up, like you said.
yeah, it's sped up, and I do worry about that trickle effect that we've talked about between URL to IRL. Like it's really problematic. I mean, this is what I worry about for my kids. I worry about them being cyberbullied, but I actually worry more about the kid who has gotten indoctrinated into an ideology online and goes up and shoots up their school. Like I worry more about that situation than them getting personally cyberbullied, right? Like that migration from online to offline and then back to online, we should be worried about that societally.
Great. Well, I have to cut us short. We could obviously
Sure.
keep talking for hours. John, thank you for joining us. Appreciate it.
Pleasure. Thanks, Shannon.